So in practice, what's happening is Quebec, technically the carbon tax isn't applying to it, but Quebecers are still consumers, and there are still goods that they import from other provinces. And so as a result, they will bear some of the incidence of the tax, probably less than other Canadians, but they will pay some of it. But it's not true that economically Quebecers aren't paying twice. Or if you bundle every type of attempts to price in pollution, Quebecers end up paying more.
Since April 1st, the hike in the carbon tax has sparked frustration and confusion across the nation, catapulting fuel costs from $65 to $80 per ton. Justin Trudeau, who keeps saying it is a price on pollution instead of a tax, implemented this in 2019 to achieve Canada's commitment under the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. The goal? To achieve a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emission by 2030. But Canadians need to know that the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement is an attack on Canada's cleanest oil and gas industry, where we only contribute 2% of global emissions in comparison to big polluters like China, who are not suppressed by the United Nations Agreement. The province of Quebec, which previously banned the exploration and extraction of natural resources on its soil, has been engaged in a cap-and-trade system with California since 2013, lacking rebates to its citizens. To shed light on this complex issue, we are joined by Vincent Geloso, Assistant Professor of Economics at George Mason University, who brings insightful perspective to the table.
I'm Vincent Geloso. I'm an assistant professor of economics at George Mason University. I'm a senior fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research and a senior economist for the Montreal Economic Institute. So I wouldn't call Quebec a carbon tax. What Quebec has is a emissions market. It is trying to do something similar. It is in partnership with California, and what it's trying to do is make people pay a price for emissions, and you're basically trading the right to produce emissions, and that implicitly imposes a price on each ton of greenhouse gases that are generated. The federal government, what it does is take a different route to do the same thing, which is to directly ask consumers to pay for, to include the social cost of pollution inside the goods via gasoline, natural gas, propane, diesel, pay a bit more in order to reflect the social cost of pollution. There are two different ways of doing so. The idea, since Quebec did that emissions trading earlier, and did it in a different way than the rest of Canada, you don't want to replicate that twice. That's the argument that's made. Legally, it is correct that they're not trying to make Quebecers pay, but it's not true that economically Quebecers aren't paying twice.
Can you explain at the end of the day, because the rest of Canada receive a rebate, we know that is not the full amount of what they are spending, but Quebec doesn't get anything. Like every single citizen doesn't get a rebate from the cap and trade system. At the end of the day, which Canadian, like the Canadian at the federal level or Canadian in Quebec, pay more at the end of the year?
So technically, it's going to be Quebecers will end up paying more. If you bundle every type of attempts to price in pollution, Quebecers end up paying more. But the reason for this is the textbook case for what carbon taxes and cap and trade should be, is that for every dollar generated from either a cap and trade or a carbon tax is a reduction in taxes, not rebates, a reduction in taxes and the elimination of command and control policies that attempt to regulate industries to do policies that are meant to reduce greenhouse gases. You want to use market signals is better not do regulations. The thing that Quebec has done is violated all of this. Quebec keeps adding regulations that make it costlier for certain goods by increasing the cost of production for certain firms and making certain goods not available, or less available, I should say. Two, they didn't cut the taxes. They actually just said whatever revenues we have, we'll fund particular programs that are meant to fight environmental problem, and they end up funding programs that have horrible track records. Best example of this, Quebec's EV subsidies, subsidies to electric vehicles. Quebec ends up subsidizing to the amount of $200 to $300 per ton of GHG, so greenhouse gases that are being reduced, the reduction that there is. This is well above what we economists estimate the cost of carbon to be, which is between $50 and $80 a ton. So essentially, it is a clear admission that Quebec just does a horrible set of policies, leaving in the end taxpayers with a bad way to fight climate change, a bad set of policies, and a higher tax burden. So yes, it's going to reduce emissions, but the only reason it's reducing emission it's by reducing economic activity rather than changing the types of economic activities that is happening, which is a really, really bad thing.
You were mentioning that the carbon tax or the cap and trade system, both are not efficient as being a good carbon tax. Can you just explain what would be a good way to use the carbon tax?
So if you poll economists and you ask them, do you theoretically agree with the idea of a carbon tax? You will not find one economist who hates the idea of a carbon tax. What you will find, however, is economists who hate this particular carbon tax, which is, I am one of them, because what a good carbon tax should be is a price on pollution, that you're trying to reduce pollution by putting that price on it, and then you cut taxes, which is number one. It's really important to cut all the other taxes. The idea of doing this cut in taxes, this tax shift, if you want, is that you are not going to contract economic activity. You're going to change how is the pie divided of economic activity between sectors, with the idea that the sectors that will grow relative to others are those that pollute less, which is what you want. But you don't want to reduce pollution by making the pie smaller. The federal carbon tax, by its own admission, doesn't do that. It doesn't. It actually does rebate, which is not as good as cutting other taxes. It also admits that they're only refunding 90% of the revenue of the taxes. So it's not revenue neutral. So it's violating the textbook example. And the other part is it's supposed to replace bad command and control policies. The federal government right now keeps adding some of these stupid policies. I really want to call them stupid. They're insanely bad policies that speak to piling on regulations that are supposed to be eliminated or no longer made necessary, just to eliminate them, and the federal government isn't doing this. So right now we have the worst of all worlds, and in fact I would actually argue that this is bad from the vantage point of a carbon tax, because now, by violating what it should be, you're reducing its benefits that it should have, you're increasing its costs, and in the end, what you're going to do is people's imagination are going to be stuck on the bad version of what a carbon tax is, rather than what the textbook version says it should be. And so forever you will taint the idea with the smell of bad politics, and it's going to stay forever, even though technically it is a great idea.
As people around the world look to our success at transforming our economy to be less carbon emitting. We have a big plan on fighting climate change, but the price on pollution is a full third of that plan that makes a huge impact. But at the same time, we know that if we're putting a price on pollution, the cost cannot land on ordinary families across the country, which is why we're delivering a Canada carbon rebate that puts more money back in the pockets of 8 out of 10 Canadian families across the country in regions where the federal backstop applies, to help with affordability.
What was your thought when you actually are hearing the Prime Minister saying that it's actually profitable for Canadians to have a carbon tax?
I didn't hear that quotation about the 8 out of 10, so I don't want to attack the Prime Minister without knowing more about his precise quotation. And as I'm used with politicians, I expect that this is and it is probably not wrong, but also probably not true either, which is the great art of politics, is saying something that is not clearly wrong, but also something that is clearly not true. But the one that I can comment on is the one that you will hear the Bloc Québécois make, which is that the Quebec isn't paying a tax. This is incorrect.
Donc, les conservateurs sont de nouveau avec des affirmations comme quoi la taxe carbone fédérale va faire mal au Québec, alors que la taxe carbone fédérale ne s'applique simplement pas au Québec. C'est un fait, c'est une vérité, c'est une clarté.
Economists don't care about legal distinctions. Legal distinctions are irrelevant to whether or not to the question of who pays for a tax. So, for example, if you say a tax goes on producer, producers can shift the cost to consumers. If you say the tax is on consumers, sometimes actually consumers can shift the cost onto producer. What matters to determining who pays a tax is who is less able to shrug it off. So if you can't shift to other goods, if you can't substitute easily, consumers pay the tax. If you can change to other goods very easily, then you are going to have producer pay the tax. So in practice, what's happening is Quebec, technically the carbon tax isn't applying to it, but Quebecers are still consumers, and there are still goods that they import from other provinces. And so as a result, they will bear some of the incidence of the tax, probably less than other Canadians, but they will pay some of it. And they will also pay it for anything that is an intermediary good. So anything that uses, it imports from the rest of Canada, things that are necessary inputs into production of final goods in Quebec, these two will become costlier, which will increase the price of final goods in Quebec. And so consumers will bear some of that cost. Will it be as much as the rest of Canada? Probably not with regard to the portion of the federal tax, but the Bloc Québécois saying the tax doesn't apply to Quebec is basically saying, well, there's a law against criminals in Quebec, and there's no criminals in Quebec because there's a law. Well, no, laws tell you something, but it doesn't tell you that it doesn't happen. It's not sufficient as a piece of information, and here the Bloc Québécois is, I believe, deliberately clinging to a legal distinction that doesn't matter.
Is there any danger that one day, the producer just decide to shift the tax to the consumer? That's it?
Well, I think that's the very point I was making. It's entirely possible that if, say, consumers are completely unable to change to other goods, then by definition, they're the ones that are going to pay the entire tax. If they can't change to anything else and they really need to buy a fixed quantity, then the tax is entirely borne by them. And it's totally possible that this could be happening for Quebec. The question is, to what degree is an empirical question and requires careful calibration of a large array of data, and there will be uncertainty around whatever estimate you generate. But by definition, the idea, what the Bloc is saying, is that this is always zero because it doesn't apply to Quebec. What I'm saying is it cannot be zero. It could be small, it could be big, it could be modest, it could be medium, but it is not zero for sure. Ergo, when the Bloc Québécois says this, it is a law, and not only that, two of the Bloc Québécois MPs are economists in full rights as much as I am, and they know what I'm saying. And they're deliberately clinging to this legal distinction. The two economists are Gabriel Sainte-Marie and Jean-Denis Garon. They know what I'm saying, and they're deliberately saying the other thing, and they know it's wrong. And that's the part that infuriates me, is good economics should always be defended on the basis that it is good in and of itself, and there shouldn't be political shortcuts made around it, and there shouldn't be any need for political expediency. You should say the truth whenever you have to say, well, not whenever, always.
Why, example, in BC, you will pay 2.10, and in Quebec, Ontario, 1.64 or sometimes 1.40 for your gas. Can you explain the phenomenon?
It's because each province tried to have, I'm forgetting the details of BC's earlier policies, but BC had its own set of policies earlier that it was trying to do its own form of dealing with climate change by doing. I'm forgetting if it did a cap and trade or if it did a carbon tax. For some reason, my mind is blanking on this, but it's largely because they have their own policy. The partial exemptions that are made, the full exemption for Quebec, the partial legal exemption, is meant to reflect the fact that you want to create a form of uniformity across provinces and not penalize the two provinces, BC and Quebec, that were first movers on this. This is the legal and political reason why, but it's still not true that economically the new federal tax has no effect on BC consumers or Quebec consumers. This is incorrect. It is a legal distinction without any economic merit. Canada's governments, and I say governments in the plural because I'm including municipal, provincials, and the federal government together, are not only doing carbon taxing, they're doing carbon subsidies in a large degree. So, for example, Quebec doesn't have pricing on roads, which means you're subsidizing people to drive more, which means that you're generating more pollution. If you had private roads, or if you had tolls on road, you made people pay a price, you'd have less driving, you'd have people commuting more or carpooling more. When I say commuting, I mean public transit. You would find people shifting to maybe more fuel efficient ways of transportation, and you would have less pollution. Quebec's government subsidizes huge cement makers that end up polluting more than the entire subsidies to electric vehicles that were meant to reduce pollution. So overall, from one end, they're increasing pollution, and from the other end, they're reducing the same amount that they created extra. So the governments in Canada are doing a lot of stupid policy that make the problem worse, and then they improvise themselves as, hey, look, we can make this better by introducing a tax to reduce pollution. Well, maybe if you didn't do that many stupid things in the first part, if you did like a first do no harm approach to the environment, actually, we probably would have a much smaller problem to deal with. The carbon tax would need to be massively smaller than what it is now, and maybe actually even there's the possibility, given Canada's huge forests that act as a carbon sink, that if you remove anything that subsidizes carbon, you wouldn't even need a carbon tax. There's that possibility that is there. The reality is Canada's governments are tainting a good idea, which is the theoretical good idea of a carbon tax, and they're doing it so poorly, and then they're the ones who created the problem in large part. And it's time we call climate change what it is. It is a man-made problem, and a subset of that man-made problem is government-made problem, not anything else than that.
Don't forget to go to our website, stopthecarbontax.com. On this website, you can sign the petition. We will deliver it. And this is for asking to axe the tax. So go over stopthecarbontax.com.